the New Testament church. And today we're going to be in Hebrews 6, verses 13 through 20, just a small little section here. But this is Paul, sorry, this is the author here talking about God's promises that bring hope. And so we'll read through this and then we will look at the notes real quick. So, starting in verse 13, for example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no one greater to swear by, God took an oath in his own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Then Abraham waited patiently, and he received what God had promised. Now, when people take an oath, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. Without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath so that those who receive the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. So God has given both his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. There is hope, and this hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is something we'll actually look at. I think tomorrow. Yeah, we're talking about Melchizedek. We'll look at that tomorrow. But the main focus here of the author here is that God's promise brings hope. And so this focus here, or this passage, focuses on the reliability of God's fairness to in his promises, right? And so the theme of God's oath here is developed with an illustration, and then a general principle, and then followed by the main point. And so God has sworn a significant oath that we see here, which gives us hope because it shows that Jesus is our permanent high priest. And we're going to dive into and get into this high priest thing a little bit more as we continue on. Abraham was the premier example, right, of faith. If you look at the writings of him, we're going to even look a little bit more when we get into what's called the faith chapter here in Hebrews. But he continued to believe that God would give him a son, right? And even was willing to sacrifice that son in obedience to God. If you're familiar with the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? So in response to Abraham's faith, God took an oath assuring Abraham that he would bless him and multiply his descendants. And so um, it's a general principle, right, in human relationships that when we take an oath, that oath is binding. And maybe not so much today. It used to be, but if we take an oath, if we promise or if we swear on something, right, then typically that used to be binding. In today's age and earlier, it used to be a handshake. If you shook hands on something, then that was a binding oath. And so in human context, an oath gives assurance, right, that something is true. And an oath from God ought to inspire us with greater confidence. So if we see God saying, "Hey, this is going to be what's going to happen," then we should have faith in God because God has bound Himself with an oath, and God's oath makes it clear that He would never change His mind because it is impossible for God to lie. We know that. We see that Psalms 110 tells us that, and so Christian hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls, as he says here, because we can put that faith in Christ, and we know that God's going to keep the oath, keep the promise that he's told us. And so in the first century, and even today, I think we understand an anchor was an image of stability and safety, right? It was something that kept you safe during the storm. It kept you locked to something. If you were out in the ocean or out in the sea, right? You would let down your anchor if it was storming real bad, or if you needed to stay somewhere, and that gave you stability and safety there. And so the author then now switches and talks about looking through the curtain, right? And so if you understand the Old Testament temple, the there was what's uh, called there was a curtain that separated the holy place and the most holy place, or the holy of holies is sometimes it's referred to. And a curtain separated the outer room and the sanctuary into which the priest could go from the inner room to the most holy place. And so only the high priest could go into the most holy place. And he could only go 1 day per year, and that was on the Day of Atonement. And even then, there was always the fear that he may not make it out, right? Some instances, they would tie a rope around him just in case something happened so that they could pull him out, because no one else was allowed to go in there, because it was going into the presence of God. And if only the high priest could do that. And even then, he had to go through some rituals before he could do it. So if anyone else went through there, they were instantly killed. And so, because it was that much of a presence of God, but because of Jesus's priesthood and who he is, he's already gone in there for us into the presence of God as our eternal high priest, and he leads us in there with him. And that's the wonderful thing, is we're now able to go into the presence of God because Christ, being our high priest, took all that on us, and now we're able to actually have and be in the presence of God. And we'll dig into that a little bit more as we get into Hebrews and look at it. And so, but the main thing, the main subject of this, is that God's promises bring hope. Right? We can rest assured that what God says is going to happen, or what he says is 100% true. And so we can believe it. And so we have that hope. If God says, hey, you're forgiven, or if you put your faith in Christ, then you're forgiven, you're going to be with me one day, you're going to be in my presence one day, then we can rest assured in that. We have that confident hope in that. Right? There's nothing that's going to be able to take that away from us unless we choose, like, which is the warning, to walk away from it. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful promise, and we have this hope in God because of who he is. He doesn't lie. We have this promise, and so we can count on that. And that's what the author is trying to get through to us here, and through to who his audience is in this letter. So, as always, I hope that you learn from it. I hope you pull from it what we're reading. I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. That way you can continue to follow along with us. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.